Hello, and welcome to Read Us a Story. What shall we read today? How about Mr. Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves? This is Coldland, which is a country somewhere near the North Pole. The weather in Coldland is winter all the time. When it isn't snowing, it's freezing. And when it isn't freezing, it's snowing. So, you can imagine how cold it is. Because it's so cold in Coldland, everybody lives there is cold as well. You can tell if somebody comes from Coldland because everybody there has a red nose. And people in Coldland aren't the only ones with red noses. In Coldland, you can see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice. In Coldland, you can even see red-nosed elephants. And what you hear most of the time in Coldland is a noise that sounds like this. The sound of the sneeze is very common indeed in Coldland, which is not very surprising, is it? This is the story of Mr. Sneeze, who lived in a small, snow-covered cottage in Shivertown, the capital of Coldland. Every morning Mr. Sneeze woke up, sneezed, got up, sneezed, got dressed, sneezed, went downstairs, sneezed, ate his breakfast, sneezed, and went to work, still sneezing.
Oh, well, I don't like sneezing all the time,
he thought to himself every day, until one day he decided to leave Coldland and try to find a cure for the sneezes. So, that very same day, Mr. Sneeze packed the things he'd need for his journey, mainly handkerchiefs, sneezed, locked his front door, sneezed, and set off. He walked and sneezed and walked his way across Coldland, and then he sneezed and walked and sneezed for days and days, until Coldland was far behind. As he walked away from Coldland, he noticed that there was less and less snow, and eventually he walked so far that there was no snow at all. And as he walked, he noticed something else. He wasn't walking and sneezing, he was walking and walking. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sneezing. Not at all. Not a bit. Not even the tiniest tissue.
I wonder why I'm not sneezing,
he thought to himself. But he must have thought his thought out loud to himself, because a voice behind him replied,
"You're not sneezing because you haven't got a cold."
Mr. Sneeze jumped, turned, and there behind him stood a wise old wizard.
What's a cold?
asked Mr. Sneeze.
"A cold is what you catch when you're too cold,"
said the wise old wizard wisely.
Oh,
said Mr. Sneeze.
But I come from a country called Coldland, where everybody is too cold all the time.
"Nonsense,"
snorted the wizard.
"It can't be too cold all the time because of the sun."
And he pointed to the sun, which was smiling in the sky.
"But we don't have any sun in Coldland,"
said Mr. Sneeze.
"No sun!"
exclaimed the wizard.
"How extremely extraordinarily extraordinary! We'd better do something about that then, hadn't we?"
Yes,
agreed Mr. Sneeze, not quite knowing what the wizard was talking about.
And how far away is this place called Cold Land?
asked the wizard.
Oh, it's miles and miles and miles away,
replied Mr. Sneeze.
In which direction?
asked the wizard. Mr. Sneeze pointed.
Shouldn't take long,
said the wizard, who then waved his wand and muttered some magic words, which wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were. Whatever those magic words were, they worked. Before you could say sneeze, both the wizard and Mr. Sneeze were transported to Shivertown, which, you will remember, is the capital of Coldland. As usual, it was snowing.
I say, this is a cold, gloomy place,
said the wizard.
Achoo!
replied Mr. Sneeze, who had started sneezing again.
Cold Land certainly needs some sunshine,
said the wizard.
And that's going to take some rather special magic.
Oh, please hurry up,
said Mr. Sneeze, who was rapidly turning into a snowman.
Now,
said the wizard, ignoring him,
I'm going to say some magic words, and I want you to sneeze 3 times immediately afterwards.
The wise old wizard then held up his magic wand and muttered some more magic words, which again wouldn't be magic if we told you what they were.
Achoo! Achoo! Achoo!
Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Then, quite suddenly, as if by magic, which indeed it was, the sun came out from behind the big black clouds, and it stopped snowing.
There now,
said the wizard,
that should stop the sneezing.
and then, after muttering some more magic words, and without waiting even to say goodbye, he disappeared. Mr. Sneeze just stood there in the sunshine, watching the snow begin to melt. After that, the sun shone every day, and today Coldland isn't anything like it used to be. You can't see red-nosed dogs chasing red-nosed cats, chasing red-nosed mice anymore. And these days, the sound of the sneeze is a very uncommon sound indeed. And even Mr. Sneeze doesn't sneeze anymore. And that isn't the only thing different about Mr. Sneeze, as he discovered himself when he looked in the mirror one morning. Can you see what was different about Mr. Sneeze? It happened one other time too. See if you can find the page where that was. And that was Mr. Sneeze by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Bump by Roger Hargreaves. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump out walking down a street in your town, and if there happened to be something to bump into down that street, then you know what would happen, don't you? Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice home, but even there, he couldn't help having those little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that the chimney pot had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump to himself. and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash! Went the living room window. Oh, gee, thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash! Went the kitchen window behind him. Oh, gee, thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up on the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash! Went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. As soon as anything got lost, or broken, or splintered, or chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or torn, or bust, or wrenched, or crunched, or split, or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the dog and spilt the milk which he was carrying for the farmer's wife, and which the farm cat lapped up. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails, he hammered his thumb most of the time, and the nail hardly at all. In order to recover from this series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do, where he wouldn't be such a nuisance to everybody. So he set off to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat into the sea and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket, and as he couldn't get it off, he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time he was walking along the beach when he walked straight into a large hole that somebody had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday, and while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea that Mr. Bump had ever had, an absolutely splendid idea. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley had a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to pick the apples like other apple pickers. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking apples than that. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump! And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased about his new job, and Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump at all. You'll remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. And that was Mr. Bump by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Snow by Roger Hargreaves. One night, 2 days before Christmas, it started to snow. All night it snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed and snowed. Millions and billions and trillions of big, white, soft snowflakes covered the whole wide world. When morning came, it was quite amazing to see just how much snow had fallen. All the houses, all the trees, all the roads, and all the fields were covered. It was almost as if a huge white blanket had been gently laid over everything. Everywhere you looked was white. And then the sun came out, and so did the children. They were all dressed up and muffled up, wearing scarves and woolies and gloves and boots so that they wouldn't catch cold. All the children were so excited to see so much snow, which isn't surprising really, because there was more snow than they had ever seen before. Some of them went on sledges, racing down the hills. Some of them, who didn't have sledges, threw snowballs at each other. One little boy even made a snowball that was as big as himself. And some of the children made snowmen. Then it was Christmas Eve. The children all went home early so that they could go to bed early, so that they could get up early to see what Father Christmas had brought them. But that particular Christmas Eve, Father Christmas was in trouble. And the trouble was that it had snowed so much that Father Christmas was stuck. Well and truly stuck. There was so much snow that his reindeer simply couldn't pull his sleigh piled high with all the presents that he had to deliver to all the children.
Oh dear,
thought Father Christmas to himself.
Oh dear me! What am I to do?
He sat down on his sack of toys and thought how he could manage to deliver all the presents to all the children before they woke up on Christmas morning.
Oh dear! Oh dear me!
He said out loud, and sighed. Now, it just so happened that Father Christmas had got himself stuck just behind a snowman, which one of the children had built. And that gave him an idea. A good idea. A very good idea indeed.
How would you like to help me?
He asked the snowman. But of course, the snowman didn't answer, because snowmen can't talk. Can they?
Of course, I'll have to use some of my magic to bring him to life,
thought Father Christmas to himself. So he tugged his white beard 3 times and muttered some Father Christmassy magic words into it. Suddenly, you might say almost magically, the snowman did come to life.
Hello, Father Christmas,
said Mr. Snow, which was the snowman's name.
You look a bit stuck if you ask me, which you aren't, but I'll say so anyway. And if you ask me again, I'd say that you need a sort of helping hand. if you know what I mean, which you probably do, because that's probably why you've brought me to life, which you certainly did. So, can I be of any assistance?
Mr. Snow, as you might have gathered, was rather a talkative sort of snowman.
Exactly! Ho, ho, ho!
Boomed Father Christmas.
Let's get started!
And start they did. Mr. Snow gave Father Christmas an enormous push, and off they went. They divided the work between them. It was Mr. Snow's job to make sure that all the right toys for all the right boys and all the right toys for all the right girls were put into all the right sacks. It was Father Christmas's job to make sure he took all the right sacks down all the right chimneys and delivered all the right toys to all the right boys and all the right toys to all the right girls. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Susan got her teddy bear. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that Peter got his train. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas made sure that John got his piggy bank. Mr. Snow and Father Christmas even made sure that little Jane got her squeaky pink elephant to play with in the bath. And then, all of a sudden, they discovered that between them, they'd finished.
I'd like to thank you very much indeed for helping me deliver all the right toys to all the right boys,
said Father Christmas, shaking Mr. Snow by the hand.
Not forgetting all the right toys to all the right girls,
replied Mr. Snow, shaking Father Christmas by the hand.
And now I'd better turn you back into a snowman again,
said Father Christmas.
Thank you, and goodbye. My pleasure,
replied Mr. Snow. And do you know, from that Christmas to this Christmas, Father Christmas always chooses a snowman to help him. So, the next time you build a snowman, you'd better make sure you build him properly, because somebody you know might want that snowman to give him a hand. And you know who that would be, don't you? And that was Mr. Snow by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he had been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name, messy by nature. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, there were tiles missing from the roof, the flower beds were overgrown with weeds, the garden gate was off its hinges, and Mr. Messy cut the grass in the garden lately? He had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed, yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor, and then set out for a walk, tripping over a brush he'd left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's house with the messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind, because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the wood until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the wood? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. It had a lovely little garden with a stream running through the middle of it. There was a man in the garden clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached.
Good morning. I am Mr. Messy,
said Mr. Messy. I can see that, replied the man, looking him up and down. I'm Mr. Tidy. And I'm Mr. Neat, said the other man, appearing out of the house. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. We're in business together, explained Mr. Tidy, and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them.
What sort of work?
asked Mr. Messy. Oh, we make things nice and neat, said Mr. Neat. Tidy things up, added Mr. Tidy. Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you, said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning.
But I don't want things neat and tidy,
said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. Nonsense, said Mr. Tidy. Fiddlesticks, said Mr. Neat.
But,
said Mr. Messy. Come along, said Mr. Neat. Off we go, said Mr. Tidy.
But,
said Mr. Messy. But nothing, said Mr. Neat, bundling him into their van, which was parked behind the house. Off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy. This is the messiest house I ever seen in all my born days, they both said together at the same time. Better do something about it, said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed, and mowed, and pruned, and snipped, and clipped, and cleared, and dug, and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned, and primed, and rubbed, and painted, and mended, and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. And then they set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, replied Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together to Mr. Messy, is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this.
but,
Said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed, and brushed, and cleaned, and scrubbed, and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy. He looked at himself in the mirror.
You know what I'm going to have to do now?
He said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried.
What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy.
I'm going to have to change my name,
said Mr. Messy. And then he chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And then Mr. Messy laughed. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed. And then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that really is the end of the story. Except to say that if you are a messy sort of a person, you might have a visit from two people. And you know what they are called, don't you? And that was Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Topsy-Turvy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Topsy-Turvy was a funny sort of fellow. Everything about him was either upside down or inside out or back to front. Topsy-turvy, in fact. It was all very extraordinary. To give you some idea of how topsy-turvy Mr. Topsy-Turvy was, you ought to see his house. The front door is upside down to start with, and the curtains hang upside down at the windows. And just look at that chimney pot. All very extraordinary. Inside is the same. Just look at that clock standing on Mr. Topsy-Turvy's mantelpiece. Isn't that the topsiest-turviest clock you have ever seen? And just look at the way Mr. Topsy-Turvy reads a book. Not only does he read it upside down, but he starts to read it at the back page. And just look where Mr. Topsy-Turvy puts the stamp when he sends a letter to somebody. Have you ever seen anything like it? Now, this is a story all about the time Mr. Topsy-Turvy came to the town where you and I live. Nobody's quite sure how Mr. Topsy-Turvy got there, or where he came from, but he did arrive, because somebody saw him getting off the train. The trouble was, he did it in a topsy-turvy way, and got out the wrong side, and fell on the railway line, which really isn't all that surprising, is it? When he'd picked himself up and managed to find his way out at the station, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went to a hotel to find a room to spend the night. The hotel manager tried not to smile when he saw Mr. Topsy-Turvy walk into his hotel carrying his suitcase upside down with his topsy-turvy hat on his head.
Well, good afternoon, sir,
he said.
Can I help you?
Now, something you don't know about Mr. Topsy-Turvy is the way he speaks. You see, he sometimes gets things the wrong way round.
Afternoon, good,
said Mr. Topsy-Turvy to the hotel manager. I'd room alike. The manager scratched his head.
You mean you'd like a room?
he asked.
Please, yes,
replied Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Eventually, the hotel manager managed to work out what Mr. Topsy-Turvy was talking about, and he was taken up the lift to a bedroom. Then Mr. Topsy-Turvy unpacked his suitcase, put on his pyjamas, and went to bed. He was rather tired after travelling from wherever he'd come from. The following day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy went round the town. But what a fuss his going round the town caused. He took a taxi from the hotel, but so confused the taxi driver trying to tell him where he wanted to go, the poor man drove straight into a traffic light.
Oh dear,
said Mr. Topsy-Turvy.
I am sorry very.
Then he went into a big department store in the middle of town. He walked up to one of the counters.
I'd like a sock of pears,
he said to the lady behind the counter.
You mean a pair of socks?
She smiled and showed him a bright pair of red socks. Mr. Topsy-Turvy put them on his hands. Then he tried to leave, but being Mr. Topsy-Turvy, he tried to walk down the up escalator, and the people who were going up the up escalator all fell over themselves. It was a terrible topsy-turvy jumble. That day, Mr. Topsy-Turvy did all sorts of topsy-turvy things. He walked backwards across a street crossing and caused an enormous traffic jam. He went to a library and put all the books upside down on the shelves and made everybody extremely cross. Then he went to an art gallery and insisted on hanging all the pictures upside down so that he could look at them properly. And then, after Mr. Topsy-Turvy had been in the town for just one day, he disappeared. Nobody knew how he went or where he went, but he certainly went, because he wasn't there anymore. The whole town breathed a sigh of relief. But what the town discovered, even though Mr. Topsy-Turvy had left, was that everything was still topsy-turvy. "Read all about it," shouted the newspaper sellers, instead of shouting, "Read all about it."
News is the here,
said the television newsreader, instead of saying, "Here is the news."
Morning good,
people started saying to each other when they met, and "Do how?" instead of "How do you do?" Everybody was talking topsy-turvy. Can you think of something that's topsy-turvy? Go on. Try. And that was Mr. Turvy-Topsy. Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Mr. Silly by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as can be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are pink. And the grass, it's blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forwards. They fly backwards. It really is a very silly place indeed. Which, of course, is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest looking house you have ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than that? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land each year they hold a competition, and the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night, lying in his bed, he dreamed about winning it. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realised that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. And after that, he had a cornflake sandwich. And to finish, he had a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking how to win that cup. He remembered 2 years ago the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house, which sounds very ordinary. But in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of his house. And Mr. Silly remembered last year when Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who was a friend of Mr. Silly's, had won the cup by inventing a car. It was quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It had square wheels. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly thought and thought and thought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella.
Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella? Ha ha!
He said to the chicken. Meow, said the chicken, because animals in Nonsense Land don't make the same noises as they do in your country. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, a monocle, and an old-school tie.
Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear a top hat, a monocle, and an old-school tie?
He said to the worm. Said the worm. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat.
Wouldn't it be silly if you didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat?
He said to the pig. Said the pig. Isn't that silly? It was the middle of Mr. Silly's walk he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he'd ever had. He hurried into town and bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled in the city square to see who was going to win the cup. The King of Nonsense Land mounted the specially built platform.
Ladies and gentlemen,
he said to the crowd in the city square,
it is my pleasure today to award the Nonsense Cup to whoever has had the silliest idea of the year. One of the silliest ideas of the year,
continued the king,
is by Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow of all things a square apple.
The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everybody to see. He felt sure it was going to win.
However,
said the king, and Mr. Muddle's face fell,
we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop.
It was a teapot. quite the silliest teapot there had ever been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause.
I therefore have great pleasure,
Announced the king.
in presenting the nonsense cup to...
Just then he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now, in the middle of the city square there is a tree. It's always been there, and it was as this tree that the king was looking in astonishment.
What
He cried.
has happened to that tree?
Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves. Bright green leaves! Not pink leaves like all the trees in Nonsense Land, but green. There was amazed silence.
It was me,
Piped Mr. Silly.
I painted all the leaves green last night when you were all asleep.
A green tree!
Exclaimed the king.
Who ever heard of a green tree? A green tree!
Shouted the crowd.
How silly!
And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands.
I think, he said, that this is the silliest idea I have ever heard of, and therefore I award the nonsense cup to Mr. Silly.
The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. And a bird perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree looked down.
Ruff!
It said, and flew off backwards. And that was Mr. Silly by Roger Hargreaves. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, be sure and like the video. And remember, you can always subscribe to the channel at Read Us a Story. Thanks.
Bye!